Thanks very, very much. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me well? I can hear me extremely well. Who would have thought 5 years ago that pollinators would become such a focal point for our industry? And in fact, the survival of pollinators and the survival of our industry, as we're beginning to understand, are really actually very, very, very intertwined. Pollinator health has become sort of the environmental issue of our day, and whether we like it or not, our industry is right in the middle of it. So my goals with you today are going to be to sort of walk through why is this issue important, what are the implications, and what are we as an industry trying to do so that we can retain the tools we need to manage pests effectively and at the same time protect and promote pollinator health. First, the commercial announcement. I'm here on behalf of American Hort. American Hort is a one-year-old baby this year. It was formed about a year ago by the joining of two organizations, the American Nursery and Landscape Association, which I worked with for many years, and a group called OFA, the Association of Horticulture Professionals. OFA was an Ohio-based group whose membership was largely greenhouse and garden retail oriented. And so we brought these two organizations together. Together, we've got a legacy of 220 years of service to the horticulture industry in America, and we feel like we're going to be much stronger together doing all the things that we do to serve our members in the growing community, the retail community, the landscape community, and so forth. Our headquarters office is still in Columbus, Ohio, because we own the building, and it's easier to find and retain a staff in Columbus, Ohio than it is in Washington, D.C. But we also maintain a Washington office because that's where we do the advocacy, legislative and regulatory advocacy, and our research programs. So we've got those two offices. Now, why am I up here instead of the guy whose name was on the program? Well, this is the guy whose name was on the program, Dr. Joe Bischoff, who's been working with us for the last several years. And I'm showing Joe in duplicate here because, you know, he accuses me of having caused him to lose all his hair. The picture on the left is a little bit more current. But the picture on the right was when he was in grad school, and it's looking pretty thin. He's got the high forehead thing going already. But Joe is really in the lead. He's our regulatory and legislative programs director, and he's really in the lead on our pollinator health-related initiative. And we'll get into a lot of detail on that. But also important is Jennifer Gray, who is our research programs administrator for our research affiliate called the Horticultural Research Institute. She is Ohio-based. Joe is in the office right next door to me. Well, Joe will do anything to get out of giving a speech, and so he got real busy about 9 months ago working on a special project which would give him an alibi so that he wouldn't have to be here today. And literally last night, his second son, Jasper, was born at 8:32 p.m. Eastern Time. So Joe's not here for all the right reasons. I think all of you who are in the business of making sure that the earth stays populated, you can appreciate why he's home with his wife. Plus, she would have killed him. So here I am. Pollinators, incredibly important debate for all the obvious reasons. Like pollinators contribute in a massive way to our food supply, to crop value. 30% of the food crops that we produce in this country rely on mostly bees, mostly honeybees for pollination. Worth noting, honeybees themselves are not a native species. They're actually an introduced species. If they didn't do so much good, we'd probably call them an invasive species. But they do a lot of good. I'm going to be focusing both on honeybees, but also on other pollinators, native bees and other pollinators during the course of my remarks. So an important debate, but also a very emotional debate. And these are the headlines that we began seeing, a little more than a year ago, and they continue on. Washington Post, 1 million reasons bees are dying, bees on the brink, NPR, our popular agricultural insecticides killing our bees. So it's become an extremely emotional debate, and many times emotion seems to be leading and sort of taking over beyond the good science information. Here's a graphic. Let me ask a question. Is Randy Oliver in the room? Randy? I don't see him. I hope he comes in. Randy is a beekeeper. He's going to be speaking later this afternoon, so I'm actually here to tell you, come see Randy as well, because you'll get his side of the story. I think you'll find that the stories we're telling are compatible. But the reason I want you to come here, Randy, too, is because when it really gets down to beekeeping and bee health and honey production and all, you know, he's got a whole lot more facts in his head than I do, and so I'm going to defer to him on any of the tough questions in that respect. But you can see on this chart, this is honey-producing colonies from 1945 all the way up to 2014. And you see in the 50s kind of the peak, with over 5.5 million honey-producing colonies in this country. I think the decline, the early stage of decline, Randy can speak to this better than I, but I think it related to changes in our agricultural practices, long-distance movement of bees, sort of a more concentrated production of bees for pollination services and all. But then the really important part on the graph is that little bump in the middle and then the steeper drop. That is when a series of parasitic mites of bees, most notably varroa mite, were introduced into the US in the 1980s. And you really have seen a trailing off of honey-producing colonies since then. Now, the good news is the last two bars, second last bar on the right here is 2007, and then the last one is 2014. So we are rebounding in terms of number of honey-producing colonies, and we're back up to 1997 levels. Bees die, okay? Bees live, bees die. And this graph shows managed honeybee colony losses. These are wintering losses, if you will, percent winter losses over a period of years, 2006 to 2014. And the good news is, I mean, considering I almost died last winter, I don't know how your winter was out here, but back in DC, I almost died from it. But yet the bee mortality that we saw last winter was reduced over what it has been in some of the other fairly recent years. Good news there. Lots of comprehensive reports that have tried to understand what's going on with honeybees. The three I'm showing you here, the first one is from the USDA, the one in the middle is from the United Kingdom, the one on the far right is from Australia. And all of these reports kind of come to the same conclusion that there are many threats to honeybee health, and let's go into those a little bit. Parasites I've already mentioned, and you'll hear me mention parasites a couple more times. Parasites and the diseases, viruses, and diseases that parasites might vector are probably the biggest single challenge. Again, Randy Oliver this afternoon can confirm that if he agrees, but from what we've heard, they're the biggest single challenge. Beekeeping practices, the stress associated with moving bee colonies around to provide pollination services, long distance movement, the stress associated with that. Adverse weather, limited nutrition, lack of good forage and habitat for bees to forage, genetic weakness, various other things. And pesticides clearly are a factor. There is no running from the fact that pesticides are a factor that affect in pollinator health. Think about it. I mean, insecticides are designed to what? Kill insects. Yes. So bees are insects, and pesticides, insecticides will kill bees if they're exposed to them in doses enough to do that job. This is the varroa mite here. You can see a varroa mite on the back of that bee, and it might have been Randy Oliver, but somebody described the varroa mite as being like you walking around with a giant rat gnawing on the back of your neck while you're trying to walk around. These things are a real serious threat. This is the tracheal mite, which gets in the tracheal tubes of the bee and so forth. And as has been said, these things vector diseases as well, and so it's really a double whammy in terms of the impact. There's no doubt that the way we are living, the way we are organizing our communities, and the way we are organizing our agricultural production are diminishing habitat for many pollinators, including bees. Landscapes that are not diverse enough, and agricultural systems that are geared toward monocultures, and increasingly monocultures of crops where weeds are controlled almost 100% because the crops themselves have been genetically modified to be herbicide resistant, so you can overspray the entire field. And so we're basically losing the weeds along the edge of the field and things like that that may have provided forage. So this is a contributing factor. But again, and you'll hear me say this over and over, pesticides are a factor. We have to look that challenge in the eye squarely, and we have to deal with it as an industry. Well, even though my talk is not solely about neonics, in the present day conversation, it's been largely about neonics. We're actually trying to change the conversation from being about neonics to being about pollinator health. But let's talk for a little bit about neonics and why they have become so much of a focus. First of all, neonicotinoid, say that 3 times fast. Neonicotinoid is just a fancy word for new nicotine. Some of the earliest insecticides that we used as a society were based on the nicotine molecule, and the neonicotinoids, basically it's a tweaked version of the nicotine molecule, which is extremely effective at controlling many insect pests, but has a much better safety profile, certainly from a human exposure standpoint, but also in the broader environmental sense. So we're using these things because they are among the safer tools, and particularly with respect to human health. They are the first new major class of insecticides that's been developed in the last 50 years. Imidacloprid was first introduced or first approved by EPA in 1994. So a couple of decades of very, very important use. They have become the most widely used insecticides in the world for all the obvious reasons. They're effective and they are relatively safer than many of their alternatives. But things started to get ugly a couple of years ago. In April of 2013, the European Union decided to temporarily ban the use of neonics. In the last few days, there have been news stories appearing that have talked about serious crop losses in various European countries. The primary oilseed crop they grow is called rapeseed, and they've been reporting, like in the UK, 15% yield reductions because of an inability to control certain insect pests. So they're starting to see they're paying a price for having moved precipitously to temporarily ban neonics, but lots of photo ops with people dressed in clever yellow and black costumes and everything else. Then closer to home, this was a major setback for all of us as an industry when in Oregon, this was June 30th of 2013, a terrible misapplication of one of the neonics, essentially a foliar spray of linden trees in a parking lot setting in full flower at a time when they were being heavily visited by pollinators, mostly bumblebees, resulted in a massive bee kill, tens of thousands of dead insects. And this happened basically in the same community that an environmental organization known as the Xerces Society, which promotes pollinator health and whatnot, is located. And so what ended up happening, tremendous media, they held little funerals for these bees, that had died, and everybody just went nuts, and that in turn led to a rapid response by Congressman Earl Blumenauer from Oregon to introduce legislation to dramatically restrict the use of neonicotinoids. Also in 2013, we saw a study released by Friends of the Earth, a so-called study of plants that you might find in the garden center, basically trying to paint a picture that everybody's garden is just a toxic witch's brew from a pollinator perspective. And I have to tell you, there are environmental groups, activist groups, non-governmental organizations, whatever you want to call them, that have a much broader agenda. They actually have an agenda to ban pesticides. I mean, those groups certainly exist. I think there are also groups that are more in the middle of the debate. They don't necessarily seek to ban pesticides, but they want to make sure that we've got wise use and we're protecting pollinator health. So I'm not going to paint with a too broad a brush and say everybody's in the same ilk, but you do have to understand some of the groups we're dealing with that are trying to take advantage of these spectacular incidents like the one that we had in Oregon do have an agenda which is to basically get rid of all pesticides. And if they succeed with neonics, then they'll figure out what to go after next and how to go after it. By January 2014, Friends of the Earth had raised a lot of money dealing with this issue. And then by June of 2014, after you had, again, people in clever black and yellow costumes in parking lots, picketing and whatnot, you had an announcement by a major big box retailer, we'll call them Big Orange just for short, to require labels of whether or not neonics had been used on their products. And that's caused a lot of consternation in the industry. The label as it now has been drafted is actually not such a bad thing, but there's still been a lot of discomfort in the industry about moving to mandatory labeling. So again, the neonics have been in the center of the storm, and yet all these comprehensive reports tell us that the picture is much more complex, that there are many factors contributing to challenges to pollinators. Now, why are we using neonics to begin with? Well, they are among the most effective controls for some of the most difficult to control insects that we've got. Some of these are they're of regulatory significance. There are quarantines, federal or state or whatever, designed to slow their spread or prevent their spread. Things like Asian longhorn beetle, which is under active eradication programs in a couple parts of the country where it's gotten in. Emerald ash borer, we're losing that battle. Has it made it to Colorado yet? It's a terrible thing out here because when you walk around downtown Denver, you see a lot of ash trees in the landscape. You have I think it's fair to say, a much more reduced plant palette in terms of urban tolerant, stress tolerant trees in the climate you're dealing with, and having this little critter come along and basically take ash out as an option is a really, really bad thing. But the neonics, again, have been a tool at least to try to deal with some of those impacts. Hemlock woolly adelgid, another Asian introduction into North America, which found its way to the east and has basically been eliminating hemlock in the natural environment. Worth noting that there was an effort to treat over 100,000 hemlock trees in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park with neonics because frankly, the adelgid would have taken them out. And indeed, those trees have so far been preserved because this treatment's been available. Japanese beetle, you guys are right on the fringe of where Japanese beetle is. It certainly is a regulatory problem. How much of a landscape problem it'll become out here, I guess, is I'll leave that to you guys to figure out. But again, it is one of the recognized quarantine treatments for being able to certify and ship nursery stock from areas that are infested with Japanese beetle. It's also more and more important in the broader international context. We are currently seeing something like 1.5 billion unrooted cuttings, young plants, vegetatively propagated annuals, geraniums, and other things that are started in offshore production facilities in a host of different countries, mostly in Central America and Africa. And these 1.5 billion cuttings come into the United States subject to strict protocols, and then they go out into greenhouses where they're grown into a finished product. Well, these things are essentially, they're inspected at the ports, they come into the plant inspection stations of the USDA at the major airports, particularly where these things come in, Miami, Atlanta, some others. And there's essentially a zero tolerance for pests. A lot of times, if eggs of a mite or an insect are found, for example, if they can't be identified to the species, the whole load will be rejected. And so with what is essentially a zero tolerance, you've got to be effective in your pest control practices, and neonics are the cornerstone for the pest management in these facilities that are producing these cuttings offshore. Our challenge on this issue is different than what we're usually dealing with. Most of the time, from an advocacy and a public policy standpoint, we're dealing with Congress. Congress is trying to pass bills that, either we support because they're good for our industry, or we oppose, or we're trying to change them because they're bad for our industry. We also deal a lot with the federal agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Labor, these various agencies that regulate certain aspects of our business. That's the standard stuff that we do all the time, but this one is different. This issue is different because it is largely playing out in the states and localities and in the retail marketplace. So we have state and local challenges, and I think in some states, and particularly at the locality level, whether somebody's well-intended or not, they can say, oh, we've got to take a stand to protect pollinators, we need to ban the use of neonics, and within hours or days, you can have an ordinance adopted. We've seen good and bad. We've seen in Seattle, for example, an ordinance was adopted. It ultimately only controls the use of pesticides on city-owned property. So it's not a private property ban on neonics, but nonetheless, some people feel that it's the beginning of a slippery slope. We fought a similar battle in Tucson, Arizona over the past year, and fortunately that one ended well. It ended well largely because there is a landscape advisory committee that was advising the city council, and there's a gentleman in our industry on that committee who was very dedicated and insisted on sort of a full discourse and good information and looking to the science. His name is Les Shipley, and so we called him Less is More because of what he did on this issue. But basically, because Les was there at the table, they were able to steer the effort into encouraging integrated pest management and so forth and so on. I bring all that up because our industry is vulnerable to these local threats because we struggle to make it part of our business model to make sure that there is a Les Shipley on every local committee like that, to make sure that we've got smart, knowledgeable, informed industry people who know the policymakers at the city level or even the state level, because we're all busy. I mean, you're in a lifestyle business, it's practically 24/7 during the busy seasons. And so too often we're caught flat-footed because we don't have the right people in the room building these relationships and able to help deal with this issue. So the state and local challenges piece is big. And then the other big issue we're facing is what we're calling retail regulation through consumer perception. I think that the activist groups that want to ban pesticides have been frustrated that EPA won't do more on this issue. EPA has moved to include bee advisory, pollinator advisory language on labels, and they may go further still. And they may do some things we don't love. But EPA knows what we know. If neonics as a class go away, the alternatives in many cases are worse, whether from a human health standpoint or an environmental standpoint. So EPA is not running to ban them, but we could find that the marketplace embraces a de facto ban if the activist groups succeed at convincing the consumer that these things are bad, they're a threat, they need to go away. So our threats, once again, it's state and local policy making, and it's retail regulation through consumer perception. So the question is, how do we combat that as an industry? Last summer, American Hort and our research affiliate, the Horticultural Research Institute, took a look at this thing and said, we've got to get the industry into a better position. And so we launched an initiative called the Horticulture Industry Bee and Pollinator Stewardship Initiative. And it's rolling along. There's a whole lot of work to do. We're making good progress. I want to tell you a little bit about what the initiative is going to try to do. 3 broad areas of focus. Every good sermon has three points. Every good stool has at least 3 legs, might have 4. Doesn't stand too well on 1 or 2. 3-legged stool. Number 1, we want to develop a platform for stewardship. We want a good practices program. Our initial focus in our world is on the grower community, and that's because the real hot seat is where grower meets retail. We have similar issues in the landscape setting as well, and I think that many of the messaging points, a lot of the information, a lot of the messaging that we're developing in this initiative will be very applicable in the landscape setting as well. But the initial focus, because of this grower retail, the big box dynamic that I spoke about earlier, the initial focus is to develop a good practices framework that people can embrace and they can point to something. And when somebody says, are you using neonics, they can say, this is the program we're following, rather than it being a yes or no answer. The second leg of the stool is supporting research. There are lots of unanswered questions. And when you think about bees and pollinators moving around on a landscape scale, maybe they come in contact with some plants that have been neonic treated and still have some concentrations of neonics in pollen and nectar. But what else are they foraging on? How broadly are they foraging beyond those treated plants? They are probably at a landscape scale visiting a lot of plants that have never seen an insecticide treatment. But we also need to know what's happening in the plant. How bee attractive are certain plants and how much pollen or nectar are they producing? So we've got some fundamental research questions which need to be answered, and they need to be answered in the closest thing possible to real time. We don't have 5 years or 10 years to sort of go slow and figure this out. And then the third point, we want to embrace partnering with other groups who want to partner with us to get to a better place. I'll go into a little bit more detail on that in a moment. So we established, to help guide key aspects of this initiative, we established a task force. There are breeder, grower, and retail members as well as scientific advisors. We're not naming the members because some of these folks were concerned about their own companies or their own brands potentially being targeted by activist groups. So they've been chosen but not named. We're not publicly naming them. They're fine. They're welcome to self-identify if anybody wants to say I'm part of this thing, but we're not identifying them. And then we also have a task force manager who is a former technical employee of a major growing operation in the Southeast. And then we're providing staffing and support services for the task force. In terms of the research agenda, I want to drill down and say, what are we talking about in the research agenda? There are several different components. One, flower morphology, pollen, and nectar production. These are things we need to know more about. How does flower morphology affect pollinator behavior? To what degree are insecticides finding their way, systemic insecticides, finding their way into pollen and nectar? Number 2, bee attractiveness. I already mentioned that. Some plants probably not so much bee attractive, others very much so, and we need to have a little bit of a better handle on where we need to be cautious. And then neonic concentrations in pollen and nectar following sort of field-relevant applications. A lot of the alarmist studies that have come out have been based on essentially dosing or feeding neonics to pollinators. That's not the real world. What we need to understand is what is the real world. And so that's another component of the research agenda. 4, we need to come up with alternative practices where caution needs to be optimized, where we're talking about bee attractive plants where we may have systemic insecticide residues in the pollen and nectar. what are alternative practices? Whether it's avoiding the use of pesticides altogether, or whether it's timing issues, or are there other mitigation steps that we can take? And then 5, we need to better understand what's going on with native pollinators, because as much as the focus has been on bees, honeybees up until this point, I think when the arguments evolve, the next thing we're going to have a conversation around or a debate around is native pollinators. And we have a very poor understanding. Even though they provide tremendous pollination services, we have a very poor understanding about the state of their health. We issued a request for proposals by the Horticultural Research Institute. We have gotten 8 very high quality submissions. We're in the process of reviewing those and figuring out which ones to fund. Of course, all this costs money, and we may be limited by how much money we have available, so the fundraising efforts are underway as well. In terms of stewardship program elements, what are the things you might be doing, like in a growing operation on the ground? What are the areas of focus that we're trying to flesh out as we tee up a stewardship program? Number 1, integrated pest management is not new, but it is absolutely the cornerstone. What are the general approaches with respect to scouting and record keeping and selection of tools and so forth? General approaches that reduce pesticide use overall are good business sense. Frankly, they save money, so we like that. Secondly, we need to flesh out what are the best management practices for these pollinator attractive plants. There are things we simply don't need to worry about. Things that are not producing flowers at all, or things that are producing flowers but are being used in a manner where they're not going to come into contact with pollinators. Good example, poinsettias. If you're producing poinsettias in a greenhouse, you don't need to be worried a whole lot about pollinators visiting them. And yet neonics are a cornerstone of an integrated pest management program to deal with threats like whiteflies. There are other plants that we're going to have to be smart about, and so timing and refined selection and so forth are important there. And then the third piece of the stewardship program is what can we do to help expand forage and improve habitat for pollinators? Some of this might be able to happen on our own operations. There may be border lands along the side of a nursery where we can actually be cultivating an array of plants which will provide forage and habitat. If it's not on our own properties, can we be supporting other groups that are engaged in national and local conservation efforts to improve pollinator habitat and forage? And guess what, folks? There is a market opportunity here for our industry. There is a marketplace opportunity. Let's talk about a different pollinator for a second. Let's talk about monarch butterflies. If you've never studied the amazing life cycle of the monarch butterfly, it truly is a thing to behold. These butterflies overwinter at like 9,000, 10,000 feet elevation in a couple of spots of the Sierra Madre Mountains in the state of Michoacan in Mexico. And then they make this epic journey where there are successive generations that make the journey north all the way up into the northern United States and into Canada. We're seeing precipitous declines in monarch populations, and a lot of the concern is what I mentioned earlier, that particularly in the middle part of the country, this wall-to-wall monocrop agriculture, increasingly using herbicide-resistant crops, and then the weed control associated with that is diminishing habitat and forage. Well, there is a groundswell. I've talked to garden centers in the Chicago area, for example, because they're on the edge of the prairie, and there is a groundswell of interest in the consumer garden media about planting things for pollinators. This is a market opportunity. There's an opportunity for us to be growing. There's an opportunity for us to be designing landscapes that integrate a long season source of pollen and nectar for these various types of insects. A little bit about minding our message. I start by saying denial is not a river in Egypt. It's also not a strategy. Denial is not a strategy for managing this issue. Presuming that everybody who's railing about this issue, they're all just a bunch of crazies and they just need to go away, and all we need to do is fund enough research to prove that we're right and they're wrong. Folks, that's not going to win the day for us. First of all, trying to prove the negative through research is a really difficult thing to do. And the groups that are on the other side of the issue are going to immediately discredit whatever we do by simply saying, oh yeah, that's big industry, that's big horticulture, in bed with the chemical companies, funding research that finds the result that they want. So simply saying we just need to prove they're wrong and this will go away isn't going to happen. Our approach rather is to really lean into the issue and, frankly, to make this issue sort of a cornerstone of the awakening that's going on in our industry with respect to the S word, that being sustainability generally. Now, some people cringe when you use the sustainability word, but fundamentally, I think we are on the cusp of profound changes with respect to how our industry is seen and how we see ourselves. And if we do this right, we have a tremendous, if you ever heard Dr. Charlie Hall talking about this, he was here a couple of years ago on the program, I know, we have such a tremendous opportunity to reposition our products and our services as not being ornamental, but rather being essential. Essential to healthy people, essential to healthy communities, essential to healthy ecosystems, economically viable and contributing. This is the future for us. And so the sustainability thing, whether you like the word or not, this pollinator health piece fits squarely in I think a broader effort with respect to positioning our industry for the future. We don't have enough in-house talent, and we are not absolutely communications experts. So part of what we've done in this initiative is to phone a friend. We've hired a group called Global Prairie. They're based in Kansas City. They have a Washington office and several other offices in various parts of the world. But they're a public affairs communications firm which has done a lot of work fairly close to this space, and they are true experts. So we've brought the experts in to help us figure out how to talk about this issue. Now, why am I bringing that up now? Because guess what? It may not feel like it, but spring's right around the corner. And when spring springs, you're going to be wondering how to talk about this issue among your customers. We're having a meeting, actually, in the Mid-Atlantic Nursery Trade Show is taking place in Baltimore starting tomorrow. We're doing a series of messaging sessions with Global Prairie leading them. They've already done a series of focus groups. We're going to take that to the next level, and our goal is, by the time spring is unfolding, that we're going to have much better information in your hands talking about how do we message on this issue? How do we as an industry, recognizing that there are as many different views about this issue as there are faces in this room. But what are the consistent message themes that we as an industry should be embracing, regardless of sort of where you sit on the continuum of your perspectives on this issue. So we've teamed up with Global Prairie. We're trying to get the messaging work done. That's essential. Every time I talk to a retailer, they're like, tell me how to talk about this issue. I need to know. Our people are on the front lines. This is one place you can go for information. If you go to americanhort.theknowledgecenter.com, you'll see the easiest way to get to the information is to look for the search term right about in the middle of the page, enter Pollinator, and there's just a treasure trove of articles, resources, etc. And folks, we have really endeavored to be balanced in the information that we're choosing to present to you. We need to be well informed about all aspects of the issue. So I would encourage you to go there and look for information where you can. Finally, and if you're in the back of the room, this might be hard to see, but I know the presentation is going to be made available to everybody. And our contact information is here. Joe is going to be taking a few well-deserved days off to welcome Jasper into the world, but he'll be back at it soon. And any one of us can be contacted by telephone or by email.